Boeing has set a new launch date for its new space capsule to ferry astronauts to the International Space Station. The unpiloted CST-100 Starliner capsule is now scheduled to launch on December 17. Joining me now live is astrophysicist and cosmologist at ANU, Brad Tucker. Brad, great to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, no worries.
Firstly, take us through the mission itself.
So, the U.S. has not had its own launch capabilities for sending humans, astronauts, into space since the retirement of the space shuttle. And now there's a big push, obviously, to resume that capability. We've heard a lot from SpaceX. But Boeing is another competition, and they developed, as you're seeing here, their version of, it's kind of like an updated Apollo capsule. This will ferry humans anywhere between 3 and 4 to the International Space Station and back. Now, before they actually carry their first humans, they need to make sure that it can dock with the space station and that it does operate safely. SpaceX did this back in April, and what we saw was it worked fine in April, but when they did their final test afterwards, that it had a failure. So this is why they repeat it, but Boeing does appear to be on track to reach a next year deadline of sending humans into space.
And how does Boeing's spacecraft work exactly?
So what will happen is this will sit atop of rocket, so it can sit currently on what's called the United Launch Alliance system. So this is kind of like SpaceX. It will launch atop of it, dock, that capsule will detach from the rocket, go to the International Space Station, attach to the International Space Station, and then they'll take humans or whatever off. The goal then is obviously to take humans who are on the space station back, return back to Earth, and again, in more akin to the Apollo era, it will deploy parachutes and land somewhere either in the ocean or potentially over the desert. So it'll be a bit different to what we remember for the space shuttles, kind of like a gliding vehicle, more similar to the Apollo. The reason people are preferring these is they're a bit cheaper and a little bit more durable, and they only really need to send humans in 3 to 4 groups of that instead of, say, 8 or 9, what the space shuttle could carry.
Brad, NASA has unveiled new spacesuits for the Artemis returning to the moon missions, and it will fit both men and women for the first time. How diverse has NASA become over the years?
Well, this is more of a necessity, and we actually saw this come to a snafu a couple weeks ago where they were attempting the first all-female spacewalk, but because they had only 3 generic sizes and the 2 astronauts shared the same size, they couldn't do it. So by having more customizable spacesuits, it means it's actually a bit lighter. These spacesuits, as you're seeing here, can be actually quite heavy when you had the oxygen and the heating and systems. Now, when you're in a microgravity environment, it doesn't feel like hundreds of kilograms, but when you're on Earth, it feels like hundreds of kilograms. So it needs to be quite durable and more customizable to the person to make it more efficient so they can move around easier because, again, these astronauts are going to be expected to spend long periods on the moon or going down to the moon's surface as opposed to Apollo, where they only spent about 2 hours.
It looks quite heavy to me already, Brad. But also we've seen Virgin Galactic has also unveiled what space tourists will be wearing next year. Take us through the design, because I understand each spacesuit will be personally tailored to each passenger.
Yeah, it's more like activewear when you see it. And that's kind of it is. They've actually partnered with Under Armour to design these more custom-sized garments. Now, they're not as bulky or as contained as those spacesuits you just saw here, but as you see, they're more form-fitting, they're more comfortable. They have a bit of compression to deal with some of the gravity environments. The big thing here is they are not pressurized suits like we saw with NASA and the moon missions, or astronauts are more accustomed to wear. Now, that's fine in most cases. However, the cabin will be pressurized, so that should be fine. You know, you think about an airplane pressurized for your comfort, they'll be doing that. The issue is what happens if it's not pressurized. Let's say they get a crack or there's a problem. By not having a pressurized suit, it will limit the options that they can essentially have if something goes wrong. So while it'll be a bit more comfortable than those bulky spacesuits, in the event something goes wrong, we might see a bit of problems actually with these future space tourists.
Well, Richard Branson there looked like he was quite happy with the fit, Brad. But just finally...
I think, yeah, he was sporting it quite well, I think.
Yeah, well, look, you know, if it's comfortable for him, I'm sure it's comfortable for the rest of us. Just finally, Brad, next year, 2 new missions will be tested to see if satellites can be grabbed, serviced or fixed in orbit. How important is this, but also in terms of cost effectiveness?
Yeah, this has been a big kind of goal of space technology. We currently have 4,500 or so satellites in orbit around the Earth. Only about half of those work. And what happens, as we just saw here, in fact, in 2009, a large defunct satellite crashed into another satellite and created huge pieces of debris. So how do we deal with these old, essentially dying satellites? A goal has been, let's service them in space. Even if you get it enough fuel, you can either return it to Earth and essentially deorbit it and burn it up safely, or if you can fuel it in orbit, that actually means then you can keep it alive, and therefore it means it's cost effective. So instead of replacing satellites every few years, you can keep it going. You know, the space shuttle was famous for doing this. It serviced the Hubble Space Telescope and other satellites, but we've lost that capability. If this works, we will actually see a new era, essentially, of longer duration satellites and also cleaning up space debris. So solving, two birds with one stone, so to speak.